And just waiting for my webcam to come in. You can do it, webcam. There you are. All right, we are live and on the air. Before I get started, can someone in chat just ping me and let us know you can both see us and hear us? Do we have? Yes, hear you. Perfect. Thanks, John. Appreciate it. I'm so nervous. John is like the maestro of live streaming, and now he's here to judge our inaugural Entity Framework stand-up. Super excited to have everyone here today. You can see we've got several people from the team. I'm going to introduce the team, and then we'll jump into this. We've got Arthur, who leads the team. Arthur, welcome.
Thank you.
Shai, who's on our team, and he's our Postgres performance guy, right?
To the max.
To the max. We've got Lawrence.
That's me.
And let me make sure I pronounce this right. Andrew, right? There he is. And then we've got a special guest with us, Josh. Go ahead and say hey, Josh. So, Josh, tell us a little bit about the team you're on and what you do.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm an engineer with Microsoft. I don't work on Jeremy's team. I work for a group called Commercial Software Engineering, or CSE for short, since we have an acronym for everything. In fact, we have multiple acronyms for everything inside Microsoft, as it turns out. But yeah, Jeremy invited me to be here, so definitely glad to be here, Jer.
Sounds great. And thanks for coming on board. So in future shows, we plan to have guests from the community, whether it's MVPs, whether it's some of our community contributors, people working on tools. So we look forward to bringing those guests on, and certainly reach out to us if you feel like there's something we should highlight on this stand-up or someone that we should have on board. For this one, we've got a special project we want to share with Josh. So we'll get to that in a minute. But just for a quick format, we're going to go through a few links that we find interesting, talk about those links, introduce you to a few new features. Josh is going to share with us a little bit about his project, and of course, throughout, we're here to answer your questions. This is our real reason for being here in the stand-up, is we want to be able to connect with you and answer the questions that you have. So we'll be sure to reserve time to answer those questions. So Arthur, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, let's go ahead and review some links.
Okay, just let me find the window to share here. Sorry. Here we go. You see that?
I can see that. Let me zoom it in for the benefit of everyone on our stream.
I zoomed it in somewhat. Is that I can go bigger if you want?
Oh no, you're good. I was just transitioning the window, and I'm gonna do one more transition here. All right, and we're gonna go top to bottom. So let's go ahead and expand this first link, the foundation for the future. So this is an article that Julie Lerman wrote for us. And if you're not familiar with Julie, she's been an incredible advocate for the Entity Framework team over time, and really does a lot of support, gives us a lot of valuable feedback. And this article really encapsulates the philosophy behind Entity Framework 3. And I love in the article, if you want to scroll a little bit, that she not only it's not just here's how you get started with Entity Framework 3, it talks about the history behind it, some of the decisions that were made, why we made some of the choices that we made. It talks about basically the Great Link Query Overhaul, definitely something that we get a lot of feedback about changes in the way that link works, right? And the way query evaluations work in 3.0 versus 2, and this dives into the background behind that. If you want to scroll a little more, we don't have to read the whole article, but the format here goes through some example changes, has some code samples, etc. So really just wanted to highlight this, especially if you're curious about the mindset behind Entity Framework Core 3, or if you're new to Entity Framework. It's a great article to really cover all the bases of what's going on Does anyone else have any comments on this one?
So I just to reiterate what you said, this is a great article that really kind of outlines what we were trying to do with 3.0 and 3.1. So yeah, brilliant.
Awesome. Let's go to the next one. So I thought this one was interesting, inferring events from EF core changes. So the idea behind this, we get a lot of feedback about the concept of using Entity Framework sort of with an event store, possibly event sourcing, etc. What this article does is it talks about a way to facilitate that in a very unique scenario. So in this case, they're using identity, and identity already has its own DB context, etc. And so they're explaining how to create a special extension to that so that you can intercept changes and actually track the events that are happening. So it's a pretty detailed article, but very informative on ways that you can extend Entity Framework to facilitate things like creating a set of events based on changes to the database. Cool.
Pretty cool article too. Okay, logging.
Yes. Everyone loves logging. It's probably the most exciting topic to not only read about, but write about. So this is just talking about some of the ways that you can tap into logging from Entity Framework Core. If you want to scroll down.
You're losing some of your credibility, Jeremy, by talking about the exciting world of logging. The article itself looks great, but if you highlight logging as a truly exciting topic, you might lose some folks.
Well, that's oh, go ahead, Arthur.
Yeah, so the thing is that logging has continually been kind of a problematic thing for .NET in general. I think with ASP.NET Core and EF Core, we have now an abstraction, the iLogger abstraction that is talked about in here. That makes it pretty easy to hook up to Serolog if you're in a kind of ASP.NET Core dependency injection application. It's not so easy to do that if you're just in a console or some other application. But in EF Core 5, we've introduced also the log2 method, which I'm not sure is covered in here or not. But that also actually makes it easier if you just get simple logs out without doing any setup. You don't have to install any package. You don't have to configure anything DI. You can just put it in your DB context option builder and get quick logs out as well. So yeah, not super interesting, but one of those things that is very important, especially when you can't do it well.
Very necessary.
Yes, exactly.
And I'll just have to defend myself since Josh attacked my integrity. I've already jumped the shark, Josh, but it's all just trying to flatten the curve from here. Too soon. Okay.
Understood.
Next link is the Entity Framework Core Part 1. So this is the first part in a 5-part series on Channel 9. This is a video series that walks through the basics of getting started with Entity Framework. And if you scroll down, the first video that we have linked to has links to the other videos. You can see that they cover how to work with existing databases, things like change tracking, querying, using some more complex query and projections, so you're not grabbing everything that is available, but grabbing just what you need. And then I love this, putting the CUD into CRUD. So wrapping it up with adding, updating, and deleting data. So fine series, check it out. They're less than a half hour each video, so it's good for just some casual watching and catching up on Entity Framework.
It's great to see so many of these videos coming from different sources. Julie has the Pluralsight courses that I know a lot of people use, but they're popping up all over the place, and there's some really good ones, which is very encouraging.
Definitely love that. Nice thumbnail on this one. So this is how to query SQL Server XML data type columns. So the context here is the way that we actually use some of the expressions to do a search on a column isn't necessarily compatible out of the box with the XML column type. And so this article talks about a way that you can extend, again, how Entity Framework works to facilitate if you have that XML column type and you want to do a search inside the properties or attributes in that XML object. I think I got that TLDR correct.
Yeah, so interesting thing about XML columns, when I first joined the EF team 12 years ago, and we were planning for EF4, the first meeting I went into was support for mapping, first-class mapping of XML columns. That got cut from EF4, and it's never come back. I would hope that we can actually do something in EF Core now, because we have a lot better infrastructure. We don't have EDM under it to make it easy. But what this shows is using these DB command interceptors, and this is something that is in EF Core now and was actually very popular in EF6 as well, because it basically lets you intercept right before we send something to the database. So you can do things like manipulate the command text by parsing expressions. So this is a really good hook for being able to kind of hook into the low-level stuff and get it to do what you want. It's also great for shooting yourself in the foot as well, so try not to do that.
I'm making notes here, Arthur. This is a shoot self. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is one of many articles that come from Eric. Eric is the author of a set of Power Tool extensions to Entity Framework and is very active as well with contributions and supporting the team, and very prolific blogger. And I love his posts because they're just short and to the point. So this is, I want to pass a dynamic or variable list of values as parameters. And Entity Framework Core has this from SQL raw. So that lets you take raw SQL. So maybe you need to optimize a query in a way that is just not as straightforward using expressions. And so you want to pass the raw SQL or call a store procedure. You can use this and project it onto your entities, and he's showing how to set up the array for that.
Nice little workaround.
Yes. And then this was probably my favorite project type to work with. I don't know if any of the viewers have had the pleasure of managing their databases with DACPack files, but this is a project that defines the schema and information for a SQL Server database. And so what he's showing is if you want to start with that definition and generate your classes from the database definition, these are steps that you can take to do that.
So one of the things that this shows is the EF Core Power Tools. This is one of Eric EJ's projects, and this is basically the GUI, the recommended way to do reverse engineering with a GUI as opposed to just doing it on the command line. You can see he's got dialogues that you can go through in a kind of wizard-like way. And it's really good. He's very responsive about putting new stuff in there, and we often point people to that, and it's just a great way where the community is really enhancing what we have here.
Yep, and the nice thing is he's got an open GitHub repo, so you can go and file issues and request new features, and that's all available directly through that. So this one is SQL Entity Framework Core 5. That's our bleeding edge. We're in Preview 3 in our release, and was comparing that with SQL Bulk Copy. And what I love about this article is this is a philosophy for the team. We're not here to use Entity Framework as the solution for every single problem, and we're not trying to force every solution into it. So this is a very pragmatic approach that looks at inserting a bulk set of records. And it turns out that the SQL feature, SQL Bulk Copy, is very well designed for that. And so it's sort of showing that for a large set of entities, you're going to get much better performance using that. And for us, that's fine, again, because we feel it's important that you use that right tool for the right job.
Absolutely.
And we had a comment in chat, if you're going to use XML in Entity Framework, might need to do some profiles. Last time I checked, XML Reader backed queries were negative for memory usage. That's me paraphrasing, but yeah.
Are we going to this one now?
Yeah, we'll jump into this one. So this one is an exciting article and a reason why we brought Josh on this. This is a USA Today article, and it's about a project that Microsoft did in collaboration with a few other companies. And it is designed to fit a need during the pandemic, which is really matching people who have personal protective equipment to donate with places like hospitals that need that. But I'm just saying that at the high level. Josh, you were on the actual team that worked with this. I kind of gave the 5,000 foot view. You want to share a little bit more about the project at a high level?
Sure thing. Yeah, and giving away the punchline, the reason, of course, why I'm here is that EF Core was actually central to our tech stack and how we delivered this. So I'll get into that in a moment, and we'll talk about how we used EF Core and what our experience was there. But yeah, the project that Jeremy did a good job kind of summarizing it at a high level. The project basically is meant to link up donors of personal protective equipment with hospitals in particular who have the need for it. And so the basic idea, it's a relatively straightforward app, not a ton of moving parts, but essentially you as a donor, you come in either with a mobile app or we have a web portal as well that kind of gives a similar experience. But you come into the front end of the app, you're authenticated. We give us a bit of basic contact information, and then kind of guided through a bit of an experience to determine the set of items that you have to donate. And we track things like sizes and other kind of details. So it's not it's a bit of a kind of a curated ontology, if you will, of items that we match up for donation. And on the other side, you have hospitals. One of the partners that we worked with was the American Hospitals Association, and so they have they're kind of an umbrella industry organization for hospitals here in the U.S. And they have thousands of member hospitals, and so we have the ability for each of those hospitals to come in, have administrators or folks come in from each of those hospitals. We kind of validate them, know who they are, match them up with the hospitals that they represent, and then they have sort of a similar experience to be able to list out and make requests for donation, essentially things that they need. On the back end, we have a matching algorithm that runs periodically that essentially uses geography and some other heuristics, as well as the item catalog itself and the donations and the requests, and matches those up. And it has some elements of fairness to it. So in the end, this is sort of like a logistics problem that we're trying to solve, and so there are aspects to it of fairness. You can naively build greedy algorithms that will satisfy requests for donation, maybe in a way that doesn't optimize spreading the donations around to the maximum number of folks so that everyone benefits. And so we went to some pains, again using some good work from our partners to ensure fairness in the algorithm. But we create these matches behind the scenes, and then the last step is to automate the fulfillment of those matches, the actual shipment out the door from the donor to the hospital where the match has been made. And so yeah, we worked on this project over the course of about it was about 5 or 6 weeks. We're just wrapping it up now, the first phase of it anyway, right now. And yeah, it was obviously we're all aware of kind of the current situation in the world. So there was quite a bit of urgency and need for this thing, obviously. And the group that I work with is commercial software engineering in Microsoft, and we do projects like this with external partners quite frequently. Usually the projects are something like 2 to 4 months in duration, and this one sort of became our kind of internal joke that we were delivering what might typically be a 3-month project. We were trying to deliver it in 3 weeks, and we ended up taking a little bit longer than 3 weeks. But we also ended up getting it out the door. So it was, it was successful. We're now matching items, so on the supply and demand side, and shipping those out via UPS. So it's been a great experience to work on. That's the high level. That's not the technical details.
Sure. So getting into technical details now. First off, doing that much of a project in 5 to 6 weeks, pretty incredible. I've been on some of those projects where, things don't wait. The pandemic isn't going to wait. So you've got to get it done. Now, you used Entity Framework Core as part of the project. Can you talk a little bit about the decision behind it and how that helped the project? But of course, we also want to be transparent and talk about, some of the challenges you may have faced as well.
Yeah, certainly. So from an architectural perspective, you've got a mobile app, you've got a web app. This is all running in Azure, of course, and so both clients are talking to an API built in .NET in ASP.NET Core. So a REST API that we're hosting in app services. All of that's all the REST API itself. The implementation relies heavily on EF Core. All of our data is stored in Azure SQL DB. And earlier incarnations of the architecture, we had talked about using Cosmos and some other things. But in the end, we decided to go with kind of tried and true relational database hosted in Azure SQL DB. And so EF Core was kind of the logical choice. Again, I mean, there are certainly other possibilities there, but the partners we were working with were very external to Microsoft. They were very familiar and comfortable with EF Core. When we started getting into, we started doing performance testing and load testing, we sort of had anticipated demand kind of over periods of time, some projections we had done, and we started doing load testing that at many multiples of the anticipated data load that we expected to face. Even at very multiples of that expected load, we found that EF Core it worked very well. I mean, even when we went down into traces and looked at the queries that were being generated, we were very happy with what was essentially the output of the queries themselves. We felt, I mean, most of what we were doing was admittedly fairly, at least on the front end side, was fairly straightforward, kind of CRUD-oriented operations. On the back end, we were also using EF to do more kind of batch style, a lot of heavy reads, and then some batch style writes when we're doing the matching and fulfillment side. But even then, it worked very well. It held up very well in all of our testing. One of the things in particular that we thought worked really well and allowed us, again, because we're moving in this very rapid kind of iterative pace, almost on a day-to-day basis. One of the things we actually thought really helped us was using migrations. We even had some, I'll call them skeptics, I'll say, on the team who were sort of, maybe had prior experiences with migrations and kind of thought, is that really what we want to do here? We didn't have somebody who was sort of dedicated from one of the patterns that, I've certainly seen before in other projects is you have one person or some small group of folks who are dedicated to the care and feeding of the database itself. And so all kind of changes go through them. We didn't have that. We didn't have that in this case. And so we got ourselves we shot ourselves a little bit in the foot kind of up front because we were moving so rapidly. We had many engineers kind of making small incremental changes to the database and to the schema really as we went. So we had lots of migrations happening, lots of incremental changes and migrations happening up front. Occasionally we shot ourselves in the foot and maybe had to backtrack a little bit or kind of wipe away a test database and rebuild it from scratch. And that was a little frustrating. We had some feedback on that. But in the end, migrations did allow us to move, when you take a slight step back over the course of 2, 3, 4 weeks, migrations were one of the key things that kind of kept us in line and kept us all synchronized. Otherwise, it would have been sort of chaotic to kind of manage the evolution, the rapid evolution of this database and the entire solution kind of all at once. So that was a big win. The other one I'll mention actually, Arthur mentioned it a moment ago that we were joking about logging, right? We actually took full advantage of the Serilog integration because again we're running an ASP.NET Core. On the back end, our matching and shipping components were running in functions, and so that's all very easy to wire in using Serilog so that you've got a nice abstraction layer there. But then we were piping everything into App Insights. It was super easy for us to go into. That's where we could go in and look at actual queries that were being generated. so that we could sort of do the trust but verify thing, right? Like, what is EF actually doing for us behind the scenes in this particular case? And that actually helped us. The ability to go into App Insights and track down specific queries actually helped us uncover a couple of places where we made some assumptions. You're using iQueryable, right? And so you're doing projections into the database, and you want all that stuff to happen down at the database level, so that you're not doing like weird filters and pulling half your database out into memory and that sort of thing. But there were a few cases early on where we ended up doing that accidentally, and it was very straightforward for us to go into App Insights, look at those queries, and say, you know what? We're actually pulling too much data into memory and then doing filtering and sorting. We need to go fix our expression, our query expression that we were using. And, that was like I'm thinking of one example in particular where there were a couple of us kind of zeroing in on this, and from like identifying the point where we identified the issue to where we had resolved it and pushed a PR so that we could get it merged and fix the problem, it was maybe an hour, kind of like round trip. So it was a really straightforward, like +1 totally for the logging integration there on the App Insight side and with Serilog. So yeah, those were the kind of like the benefits. I guess we wanted to talk a little bit about challenges too. Yeah.
Go ahead, Arthur.
So yeah, before we get into challenges, we talked about this kind of offline a couple of days ago, and one of the things that I found really interesting was your decision near the beginning to not use a customized repository pattern, to not use Cosmos, and decide to use SQL Azure. And that's kind of one of the themes that I've seen quite often in a lot of apps, that people start out with this idea that they need all of these abstractions and all of this additional work on top. And if you actually just cut it down to the DB context and use SQL Azure rather than trying to do something more complex, you can come up with a perfectly performant solution that meets your requirements with a lot less work to get it there.
Well, and the testing side of that is really and we were talking about this the other day, Arthur. The testing side of that is really key for us, because now you can fully mock the DB context, and you don't have to go through all the gymnastics, like you say, of kind of abstracting it behind a repository or something like that, just to make it testable. And that was a huge win for us. In fact, that was a lesson learned. We just recently did a retro on the project, and that was one of the folks who was working on in that particular bit even called that out and said, yeah, that was something that I last worked with EF several years ago, and we had to do all that stuff then. I assumed I still had to do that now, and it was like a pleasant surprise that we didn't. So, yep, definitely.
So we had a comment and a question from Michael Powell on YouTube. His comment was, lessons, migrations cannot happen in a vacuum, not without communication. And I think the reality on theirs was they were moving like at a sprint, so they were a little bit out of breath to shout over the line. But yeah, good advice there. And then there's a question. I don't know how much of the details of the project are under NDA or what you can share, but he did ask who the partners were that you worked with on the project.
Yeah, I think given that they're mentioned in that USA Today article. In fact, I think they're actually on screen right there. So the American Hospitals Association was a big kind of umbrella partner. Kaiser Permanente and the UPS, an external partner, Merit Solutions, who were really good partners for us on the engineering side, and then Kearney, who did some of the work specifically around the matching algorithm. So yeah, so that's all public knowledge. At least I hope so, given that, again, it's all in USA Today. Hopefully I haven't given anything away.
Yeah, no, it's you were just reading off the screen, so I'm pretty sure we're good. And then definitely want to talk about challenges. Julie asked this question: are these lessons learned blogged somewhere? I think we added a extracurricular to-do item to your list.
Yeah, Julie, I think you've given us some homework. So the short answer is no, not yet. But Jeremy and Arthur and I have chatted offline. I suspect between the three of us, we can certainly find a home for that. So so certainly noted.
Okay.
So challenges. I think I mentioned the kind of the yin and yang of migrations, and I think it was Michael who who chimed in there as well. And exactly right. I mean, migrations. They're a powerful tool, but they're a tool, and that means you can misuse the tool. And luckily, we didn't. I would say we didn't grossly misuse the tool. I think if anything, we were just maybe a little over-eager, overly optimistic. And frankly, we were scrambling around a little bit. I mean, it literally was the kind of thing where on a day-to-day basis, almost during stand-up, we would just remind one another, hey, we're actually trying to save lives here. And that just beyond EF and any technical discussion at all, that it really gave a really interesting spin on the entire project. It was just it really helped you. It helped you focus in on what was important, but it also made it hard because, at the end of the day, we're all engineers, right? And we know that even if we want to think faster or do it faster, it still takes time. And it was frustrating. It was hard, but it was also just the reality. And so, yeah, I mean, that manifests itself certainly in the, if we look at migrations in particular, like everybody's just like in the mad scramble, sort of like figuring out, that early stage of the project where you're sort of sorting through what does the domain look like, what are the entities you're working with, what are their relationships with one another. If you don't do that deliberately, then yeah, you end up tripping over yourselves a little bit. Definitely not the problem of the fault of migrations. It was just our use of them. I think probably something else, something else that comes to mind that's kind of worth calling out. We had a need to use encryption to essentially encrypt pieces, not like large swaths of data, but pieces of data that we were reading in and out or flowing through EF Core. And so we ended up there. It ends up there's really two options there, or kind of two broad options. Arthur can even probably talk a little bit more about this. There's certainly sort of probably the general guidance, I think, or the larger guidance, which now we've realized, lesson learned for us. The ability to just turn on always encrypted at the database level, and then work with that using EF Core mostly transparently, I think is probably where we should have ended up in hindsight. What we ended up doing instead was basically defining some custom code and using some custom serialization code along with some custom attributes to sort of discreetly identify particular properties that we wanted to encrypt, and then kind of doing the right thing as the data kind of flows in and out of EF to do encryption and decryption, wiring it into a key, basically using encryption key that we were storing in Key Vault. And that pattern worked. It was fine. We were pretty happy with it in the end. And it's actually some code that I think we are actually planning to put on GitHub at some point soon. But again, I would turn this back to Arthur. I think probably his guidance in general was more, always encrypted is probably your friend here, because that lets you avoid writing your own custom code, particularly custom security code, which is always a little bit, can be a little bit dodgy. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of things about that. Certainly, the value converters feature, which essentially lets you, convert any value from one form to another when you're saving, and then do the opposite when you're reading. We did consider that people would want to use that for doing encryption, and it's somewhat built into the ASP.NET Core identity model for that. I haven't actually seen a lot of people using it. And that may be because always encrypted, at least on SQL Server, if you're using SQL Server, is available. And it works pretty well with EF Core. I wouldn't say it's like perfect yet. And there's a bit of history behind that. And this is kind of technical, but we're on an EF Core stand-up, so I'm going to be a bit technical. So basically, back in the day, historically, both SQL Server and SQL Client have been very relaxed about the type of parameters that you use. So you can pretty much send for example, a date time parameter, and if your column's date time too, it'll just coerce it and use it. Now, you might have perf impact in doing that because of indexes and all kinds of stuff, depending on what you're doing, but it would work. When they introduced, and then also related to that is that SQL Client has historically not been great about how it handles parameters in some ways. So, for example, decimal parameters, if you specify 18.2 as the precision and scale, it will then truncate before it sends your data to the database to a precision of 2, or is it the scale? That's the precision, right? I don't know. Whichever one it is, the one that's 2, the one that's after the decimal point, that's the one that gets truncated. So that's not ideal because SQL Server, if you don't do that, will round. So by setting the parameter values in SQL Client, you end up with a different behavior than if you don't. So a couple of things caused issues with that in Always Encrypted. Always Encrypted basically started requiring the parameters exactly match the types in the database. So all of this kind of, it just works even though it might not be quite correct, it kind of goes away, and you have to have everything precisely mapped. So that's, in general, you can do that with EF Core. It might be a pain, but that's what Always Encrypted does. If you're reverse engineering a database, we'll do it for you. Otherwise, you can always just tell it, this is a date time 2 or whatever if you're doing your code first mappings manually. But then that has this issue with decimals, where if we set 18.2 in the parameter, which we need for Always Encrypted, it'll start truncating, which we don't want it to do. So luckily, since SQL Client has now moved to an external package and is not tied to the .NET framework, and so is actually able to make sensible changes to evolve itself, it has now fixed that. Which has existed for 12 years. So now if you do 18.2 in SQL Client with the new Microsoft Data SQL Client, and there's a preview of the 2.0 out, now it will round rather than truncate, and so the behavior now aligns with SQL Server. So all of that is then coming together so that we can then make EF Core 5 basically it should work seamlessly out of the box with Always Encrypted end-to-end, and that would be our solution for doing encryption in the future.
Very nice.
That's my thoughts on that.
I guess maybe I have one more word to add on that. So as was mentioned here before, Always Encrypted is a SQL Server feature. So obviously that's going to work if you're on SQL Server. If you're on SQLite, you're out of luck. So then you have to use some sort of value converter based, or there are other options, by the way, as well. And Always Encrypted also, unless I'm mistaken, I'm not a big expert, but it's a whole database kind of solution. So you don't get to pick and choose which columns you're going to encrypt and which you're not. That might be a problem, and I mean, that might not be what you want, what you're looking for. So once again, I'm just basically trying to say that there are some valid scenarios where you're going to prefer maybe a value converter-based solution or another one. So in other databases, sometimes you handle encryption by simply doing file system encryption. Now, that's the Postgres kind of recommendation. You encrypt the file system where the files are. That takes care of the at-rest aspect of it. Of course, you use something like TLS, connection encryption, to make sure that on the network everything is encrypted. And these two things together gives you something which is like what SQL Server does with Always Encrypted. So there's various solutions around encryption. It's always, a rich topic.
So we
I'll make sure, Jeremy, that we circle back. Again, our team, I think we're going to put at least a simplified version or an isolated version of our value converter solution on GitHub. So I'll make sure you get the link to that so that you can circulate it.
Nice. We'll bring you back on for that.
Cool.
But yeah, so we'll look for that link. Now we have several questions come up, and some of them aren't directly related to what we're talking about, so I'm going to move those to the end. But there's one that said, wait, so iRepository is a bad pattern now, or just when used with EF Core? And I think the point is not that it's necessarily a bad pattern. It's a question of when you're approaching the application, what are your requirements? And so repository pattern, for example, is something that was designed for testability and to be able to possibly swap out your data access layer. But in reality, I think we find not too many people do that as often midstream. But the idea of the DB context is the DB context is something that you can mock and that you can test. And so if testability is what you're targeting, it's not necessarily a reason to go to another pattern. There's a lot you can do with DB context directly. It doesn't mean those patterns are invalid. It means instead of using a pattern up front, really we encourage people to evaluate what the needs are and find the simplest approach that meets those needs, because it's very easy to overcomplicate a solution. And the last thing that you want is to be on a project that has 4 layers of abstraction. iRepository of T goes to iData access of T, and you make one change to one column and you have to change it 5 different places because it propagates through that, as opposed to a DB context, which will just update with the model. So it's not that iRepository is bad. It's just a shout out that it's not always needed, I think. Does the team generally agree?
Yes, absolutely. it's interesting that, I mean, we only have 20 minutes left. I'm not sure how we want to spend the time, but I do have up here that I could share if you want some of the. So stepping back slightly, I wrote recently, a couple of weeks ago, new documents on how you test testing with EF Core, and as part of that, we have a sample, and I could show a few parts of that sample if we want to, but I don't know if we want to spend the time doing that or answering questions.
So my thought is, what if we go through our community contributions so that we can highlight some of those, and then we can look at the testing example, and then we can close out with questions. Does that work?
Okay. Yep.
Yep. We had a ambitious set of links to walk through today. So do want to highlight a few changes that so we do have our blog post bringing out preview 3. Do you just want to call them out from that post, Arthur, and then?
Yeah, let's do that. Well, actually, no. Let's. So this is let's just talk about this last one here, because this is a good one to talk about. So we have with EF Core 3.0, we released the Cosmos DB provider, as finally an RTM version. There are still a bunch of missing features in there. Missing as in, we're not 100% sure what exactly people will want to do until we're kind of gathering feedback. So we definitely want to hear feedback on that. But at the same time, we've had a lot of people in the community send contributions. This one here was about adding with partition key support to queries. So you can do a link query, you could do with partition key and tell it which partition key, and then it will extract that out of the query and pass it through the Cosmos API to make a more efficient, to make the query as efficient as it can to the Cosmos model. Andrew will jump in if I got that wrong at all. But this is a really cool way that, and we have many contributors. Going back to the blog post again, we try to list these are just the people. So this is the team. This is just the people who have contributed so far to 5.0, either documentation or to the product itself. And you can see that it's a pretty active community. And you know, we're only up to preview 3 so far. So this is going to get bigger, and we love that, and we love working in the community on stuff.
Awesome.
That's what I had to say on that.
Cool. So I think instead of going through can we highlight the docs page really quick, and then let's look at your testing example, and then we'll answer some of these pending questions. So just for those who have not visited our documentation recently, we overhauled our hub page. The idea is to give you faster access to what you need without drilling down several layers deep in the table of contents. So you can do one click, get started with a very basic console Entity Framework core app. We take you into some of the different references, support databases, etc. And then we have these cards so that you can see at a glance what databases we support, what our providers are, how to create a model, query, save data, etc. So we encourage you to take a look at that hub, and this is your page. We're creating this page for the community, so we want to make sure we get feedback. So we have a documentation GitHub project. We do everything in the open, whether it's code or documentation. So if you see things that you think can be optimized, if there's something missing, please go to the documentation repo. It's github.com/.net/entityframework.docs. And you can file an issue there on the documentation and either let us know what we can fix or what we can add to that.
Okay.
Let's talk testing.
Let's talk testing. So rather than going through the actual doc, I'm just going to try and share my screen here. We'll see if this works. I'm going to be sharing from Linux, so you never know what's going to happen. Okay, and then I'm going to have to make things bigger.
Linux.
What's that?
Don't badmouth Linux.
Sorry.
Yeah, you are definitely going to have to make things bigger.
Okay. Can you guys see that now?
Can see it.
See is a relative term. There we go. That's better. I would go even 1 or 2. Yeah, right there, I think.
Okay.
is good. And definitely
So,
in chat, if you need him to zoom more, let us know. But hopefully this is a good level.
okay. So what we have here is this is a very simple, just a web API application. It's got a DB context in there. We've got two entity types, item and tag. I'll show this very quickly. These are also written in ways that are more like you might write real entity types rather than just auto properties that go, with getters and setters. So, for example, I have a private read-only field for the primary key, so I don't expose it to the application because it's really a database concern. And then we have this private constructor, and this is what EF will call when it's setting the primary key for you. Or you can create a new item without the primary key set publicly and then save that, and EF will generate the key and set it into this. So there's a few other things in there, but let me go more to the testing. So I have some tests here. This is my item controller tests. And basically, the setup here is pretty simple. Let me get to the top here. So we have the test, which is an abstract class because it's derived from the multiple providers that I want to show testing with, and it takes DB context options in the constructor, which will be set up for the provider. So I'll show that in a minute. And then when the test instance is constructed, it runs a seed method. This deletes the database and creates it again. This is a really easy way to just ensure you have a clean database for each test. And then we add some seed data and save it. And then each test basically now creates a context, injects the context into the controller, and then runs something on the controller and determines whether or not it worked. Notice that we're creating a different context for seeding and a different context for the test, because that's usually what your application is going to do, especially if it's like a disconnected, like a web API or a web app. Also, when we want to do tests that are actually mutating the database, so this test that I can add an item. So here we create one context instance and we do it, and we say, and this post item method is actually saves to the database, and then we create another context instance to verify it. So this actually, if we just verified it here, we wouldn't necessarily be checking that we'd actually saved anything to the database. Okay, so but look at this. So this is the SQLite version of the test. So, and you say here, all I'm doing is use SQLite and then giving it a file name. So I'm creating a test on the obtaining the file on disk, which for SQLite is super fast. It's just an in-process file. If you've got an SSD, you're not going to run into perf issues with that. So I can run those tests. I'm sure this is tiny on all your screens, but it is running, and it has said in this case that they all have passed. So you take my word for that, or you maybe can see a bit of green down there. We can do the same thing with the SQLite in-memory database. So you can see a SQLite allows you to create a connection with file name memory, and that means create it in memory. The thing with the SQLite in-memory database is its lifetime is tied to the connection. So in this case, we have this method. It creates the connection. It opens it. Now that's important because once it's opened, EF will not then open and close the connection, which means this connection is going to stay open for the test, which means the in-memory database is going to stay around for the test. So we do that in the constructor, and then we use this. Look, this is obscure. We need to make this better. You shouldn't have to know about this. It wasn't written for this purpose, but it works. This is basically allowing me to extract the connection that we created up here and save it. And I only do this so we can dispose it at the end. So if we run any of these two SQLite tests, let me just demonstrate by running in the debugger what's actually happening when we run these things. So sorry, that's the wrong one. Let me go here and debug unit tests, and I've set up some breakpoints so you can see what's happening with when I run these tests. So first off, we get the test class is created, and this is XUnit, but most kind of unit type testing frameworks do the same thing. Created an instance of it. We run our seed method, which creates and deletes the database, deletes and creates the database, and now we're running the test. Now, when we run the next test, you can see we go back to the top. We create a new instance of this test class. So there's a new instance per test. We seed the database, we keep going, and we do that for each test. So I'm just going to click through here. You can see we're continually going through the constructor and the seeding till we get to the end. And now I've pressed F5, and so it's going to try and run something that it shouldn't, but I'll stop that. Okay, so there's some interesting stuff in the article about testing with the in-memory database. So for example, I have one with the in-memory database here, and actually one of the tests will fail, and that's because the in-memory database doesn't support one of the things we're testing. That's a very useful thing to learn about, but I'm not going to go into that now for the sake of time. Instead, I'm going to go over here to where we have shared database tests. So basically, these tests are essentially the same tests that we saw before. So I have, can get items, basically all the same tests. However, what we're doing here is we're using a shared database fixture, which is an XUnit concept that allows you to create something that's going to be used for all executions of the test. So what this is going to allow us to do is basically not recreate the database every test we run, but only create the database and seed it once for all of the tests. So we can demonstrate that by running these again in the debugger. If I can do that, we go to here and debug tests. So what we should see here is the first thing that happens when I run these is I didn't actually show the fixture, that this is the fixture. So we're creating an instance of the fixture. That's creating a connection, and that will be shared by all of the tests. And then we run a database seeding, so it's seeding. So this is going to delete the database and create it again, but it's only going to do it once, so we won't see that hit again. And I'm running this actually on SQL Server, so that just dropped and created a SQL Server database there, so it's entirely clean and it's seeded and ready to go. And now each test is going to run, so that test is going to run, that test is going to run, that test is going to run, and so on throughout without actually having to create the database again. So this is a way that you can have a shared database and use it safely between tests, and then we dispose the connection at the end. One last thing, because I know we're short on time. When you're mutating a database in a test like that, if multiple tests are going to then use that same database and they're expecting a well-known set of data in it, that's not going to work if you mutate it halfway through. So what we do here is a fairly common trick. We create a transaction. So we have a fixture method here that is, let's say that's not the fixture method, that's in DB connection. We have a fixture method here that creates the context that takes the transaction. So each context is enrolling in this transaction. So we can still have a context, save stuff, create another context, read it back, and have that use the mutated database. But then we never commit that transaction. And when you dispose a DB transaction without committing it, it gets rolled back. So when this using ends, the transaction gets rolled back and the changes are not visible to any of the other tests.
So that's actually interesting. It ties into a question. First, someone asked if we link this project. So in our documentation, we have a detailed documentation page that describes the testing and then links out to the sample. So this sample is a publicly available sample. The other question was, are transaction scopes supported by Entity Framework Core?
Yes and no. It depends what you mean. That's a very loaded question. So basically, system transactions is in .NET Core now. Transaction scopes, whereby you have a ambient transaction that is automatically enlisted, is supported by multiple database providers. SQL Server supports it. I believe Postgres, right, Shai, does that?
Yep.
But I think SQLite, for example, doesn't yet support that. So it depends somewhat on the database provider. Also, this is only system transaction supports for individual transactions. It's not the support for distributed transactions does not exist in .NET Core.
Okay. And that was a helpful clarification. And just so everyone knows, if you go to live.net, live.net, and link into the show on the YouTube, or actually on that page, we have a link to our show notes. And that link is all the links we cover in the show. So that's how you can get to the link. We have the link in there that leads to this testing page. So if you want to find that, live.net, click on the Entity Framework show, and you'll see underneath it, it has a show notes link, and that'll take you to the list of all the links that we have.
And actually, if you want to get the samples, what I have basically here is I've just cloned the docs repo. So Entity Framework docs repo is cloned, and this is then the testing solution is in there, and you can just open it in your IDE of choice.
Nice. Did you have anything else on testing, or did we want to tackle some of these questions from chat?
We can tackle whatever questions people have.
Okay.
I guess I'll just add for the
go ahead.
testing, one last thing is to keep in mind parallelization, because if you use something like XUnit nowadays, then by default it's going to parallelize different classes. Keep that in mind if you're mutating. Once again, even if you're using transactions, you might see some effects. So it might just be better to disable parallelization.
Right, I think at least as interesting, because as far as I'm aware, if you're using a transaction for your mutation, then it won't matter because the other tests aren't going to see it anyway. So I do talk about the parallelization in the doc, and while it's not actually necessary in this case because I only have one test class and one fixture, and so they're not going to run in parallel, this is why we have this locking code in here. So you can share this fixture between multiple test classes, and it globally locks, which won't be an issue. You don't need to use lock free or anything like that. Just do a normal bog standard lock there, and that'll ensure that even for multiple tests, you get one clean database instead of seed data.
Sure.
Awesome. So we have some time for a few of these questions. This one is a interesting one, a recent one that came up. Are the link queries cached, or does EF Core have to convert them to SQL every time they're executed?
They're cached. There's a multi-level cache mechanism.
Okay. And then how do you make a field unique in EF6? That's a pretty specific question.
EF6 has very poor support for unique constraints, and that's primarily based on the fact that the EDM itself doesn't have very good supports for unique constraints. And in fact, one of the things that we were looking at when the idea was proposed that we do what has become EF Core was adding unique constraints to EF6. And it's not there, and it's not going to be there because EF6 is what it is, and it works for a lot of people, but EF Core is the architecture that's allowing us to do those things, and unique constraints are fully supported and have been from V1 in EF Core.
And then we had a question of, I'd love some more guidance features on how to deal with disconnected scenarios, graph reconciliation, and duplicated objects. I'm using Blazor, and this generates lots of code.
Yeah, very good question. We've actually been working with the Blazor team, Jeremy and I, and other people, Shai as well, over the last few weeks, and we have guidance that we're preparing for doing that in Blazor specifically. With regard to disconnected entities, yeah, there's more helpful stuff we could do there. We have kind of the building blocks, but there are other things that we could build on top of that. The thing is, it's something where EF can't be too opinionated about it. At least can't only be opinionated in one direction about it, because there are many different ways of dealing with disconnected entities, and they have their pros and cons in each cases. So we've tried to kind of give the building blocks for you to do what you need to do, but we would like to put some more end-to-end solutions on top of that so you can say, right, I buy into always requerying before I save, for example. Then you can just do that, opt into that, for example.
Yeah, and that's something I'm really excited about that we're focused on for the documentation over the next weeks or months or however long it takes. Not ready to commit to a deadline yet, but we are actively working on reference examples for end-to-ends, for Xamarin, for Blazor Server. There may be something there for Blazor WebAssembly as well. We'll stay tuned for that. And we plan to have some reference projects to make life easier so that you can look at something and something beyond just a Hello World demo app. We're looking at something that does, filtering and sorting and allows you to edit and view and do some of those basic CRUD operations that you need to have done. And that will be projects and documentation. So it's something the team wants to make sure that you have available. And we're working on making sure that the guidance is designed in a way that really makes you fall into a pit of success, right? We don't want to mislead. We want to make sure our samples do all the right things, and that's part of why it's taken some time, just due diligence behind that. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone on the team, have you seen a question in chat you want to address before we wrap up?
I haven't been paying too much. I haven't read everything, so I don't know.
Well, here's a good one. Just in chat, are you aware of Entity Framework extensions?
We've No, it says on the stream that everybody lost audio.
Okay,
Uh-oh.
I got us back.
Okay, we're back.
We're back.
Okay. Entity framework plus extensions and so forth. Yeah, so there's a lot of good stuff there. We certainly we're very happy for people to use external third-party extensions if they work for what you need. Some of those extensions do things in ways that we wouldn't necessarily want to do for various reasons due to the architecture. But there's often a lot of the things in there are places where we have ideas to introduce those features. It's, we're a small team. We have 8 people, including myself, who's really a manager, so not supposed to code, and Jeremy, and then 6 people on developers on the team, and some of those things that we will add, but they're lower down the list. We also are trying to make it possible for community people to contribute. So with Maurice on our team, who's not on the call, has been doing a lot of research into temporal tables so that we can actually put some guidance up on that and potentially a prototype that maybe the community can use to work on that. I think it's worth saying that we really truly believe in open source, and I do, and everybody on the team does, and at Microsoft in general, open source is the thing now, and it's not just lip service. It's like we believe it. So putting this stuff out there, having it on GitHub, having people be able to build extensions, having people potentially fork things. There's a fork of EF6 called EF Classic, which is a commercial product. That's fine. The reason for being open source is so that we can do all of this stuff and people can use the code in different ways. So I just think it's great that there's extensions and stuff. And yeah, we want to get the product better, but it's also great that people are doing third-party things.
Thank you so much for that. Hopefully my audio is working now. I know someone said it was a little crackly, but that is, we are at the end of the hour. We certainly appreciate everyone coming on to this first stand-up. We plan to do many more. We're definitely doing one the first Wednesday of each month, but we are considering going bi-weekly. So if you have an opinion about that, reach out to us online or however you'd like to, and we will look at that scheduling. But that is a show for today. Again, the show notes are on live.net. Thanks everyone for coming out. Appreciate our guests, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.